Was Russia justified in its invasion of Ukraine?
I am a bit of a historian. I like context, and what I've always said publicly is that all heads of state have to make determinations for their own security.
Was why the Ukraine crisis is the West's fault. Do you agree with that premise?
Far too simplistic. Again, global politics is messy and complicated affairs. What I will say
Sounds
is
like you think it's okay for one of our adversaries to invade one of our allies.
Welcome back to Freedom Forge. Today, we're reacting to an eye-opening exchange from a recent Senate confirmation hearing. Senator Mark Kelly, Democrat from Arizona, grilled Mr. Lomire, the nominee for Undersecretary of the Air Force, over a social media post. They're talking about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, NATO expansion, and whether Lomire's views line up with American interests. Let's break it down, and I'll give you my thoughts as a proud, unapologetic American patriot.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Senator King. Mr. Lomire, you recently made a post that seemed to indicate Russia was justified in its invasion of Ukraine because Russia feared NATO expansion. This isn't just untrue, it's also the exact kind of misinformation that Russia pushed to justify them rolling troops and tanks across the border into Ukraine and bombing Ukrainian cities. So, Mr. Lomire, I want to be very direct here. In your opinion, was Russia justified in its invasion of Ukraine?
Thanks, Senator Kelly, for taking the time to meet with me a week and a half ago. In answer to your question, I'll say as directly back as I can as well, and in respect, I don't believe I used the word justified in my post. However, I am a bit of a historian. I like context, and what I've always said publicly is that all heads of state have to make determinations for their own security. And so when I say something like that, whether it's with Vladimir Putin or any head of state, I'm saying that they are entitled to make those decisions whether we agree with them or not. Now, it's a bit outside of the lane of the Undersecretary of the Air Force, of course, whose role as a Chief Management Officer will be to organize, train, and equip forces for the fight for any given administration to meet combatant commander needs.
Well, I'll give you that the post did not say that, but you did post a article by John Mearsheimer that said why the Ukraine crisis is the West's fault. You did not say that was your opinion. So I'm going to ask you the question again. In your opinion, was Russia justified in its invasion of Ukraine?
For context, which always, of course, Senator, as you're aware, matters a great deal, that was an article that was written by John Mearsheimer, an international relations scholar, in 2014, and it was a comment about Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014 and some of the history leading up to that. It was not an article that had any bearing upon what happened in the decade that followed per se, but it was an international relations academic piece that talked about the annexation of Crimea. And his opinion in that article, and this is a very insightful article, in fact, traces through the history of NATO expansion since it was created. It's, again, an academic piece. It's something that we study at strategy school.
Crimea was part of Ukraine. In my view, still is part of Ukraine.
Yes, Senator, and the point I just make in bringing that up is that the opinion that was shared in that post about that article had to do with past conflict and implications for the ways in which allies interact on the world stage and how that influences the decisions that heads of state make. It was not in any way intended to excuse the behavior of any head of state, including President Putin.
So now I've got two questions. So the title of the paper was Why the Ukraine Crisis is the West's Fault. Do you agree with that premise?
It's an enticing title. Again, it was pertaining to decisions that were being made a decade prior to the conflict that you're asking about. It's an incredibly informative academic work that is based in international relations theory. I very much like the paper and would still recommend to people today, if they're interested in understanding the conflict in the region, it's a rich resource of information.
Do you agree that the Ukraine crisis is the West's fault?
No, because that's far too simplistic. Again, global politics is messy and complicated affairs. What I will say is that it's very clear. A couple of years ago, Russia invaded Ukraine, and Ukraine's been on the defensive trying to fight that war, and of course has had bipartisan support in this Congress.
So was Russia justified in invading Ukraine?
Senator, with respect, I've not said that.
Well, that's why I'm asking you the question.
I know you are, and I really, the reason I'm hesitating shouldn't be taken or interpreted to imply an answer one way or the other. I like context. I don't like yes and no's, and I don't like soundbite media. I'll say that I believe that heads of state retain the right to make decisions on who they'll go to war with. That's not something I decide. That's not something even the United States or its leaders get to decide, even as much as we want to weigh in on those positions. I can say, though, for certainty that
So it sounds like you think
see.
it's okay for one of our adversaries to invade one of our allies.
I did not say that. What I will say is that I'm grateful that there are currently efforts underway by this administration to try and seek a peaceful resolution of that conflict. I think it's time that it end.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, let's stop right there. This is classic D.C. politics. Senator Kelly jumps in, accusing Lomire of spreading misinformation just because he shared an academic article. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm sick and tired of hearing the word misinformation thrown around every time someone brings up a perspective that doesn't toe the party line. Sharing an article by a respected scholar like John Mearsheimer isn't the same as endorsing Putin's invasion. Notice Mr. Lomire's answer. He never says he supports Russia's invasion. He's a historian, folks. He's talking about context, which is something the left seems to ignore unless it fits their narrative. We need leaders who understand history and strategy. If you don't know the history of NATO expansion, if you don't know how these global alliances work, you're not prepared to defend this country. So here's the senator, acting like sharing an academic article is treason. Let's get real. Mearsheimer's piece is controversial, sure. He argues that the West played a role in the crisis by expanding NATO closer and closer to Russia's borders. That doesn't mean it's Russian propaganda. It means we're willing to look at all sides. You know who else studies their adversaries' perspectives? The U.S. military. That's why we win wars. And there it is. Lomire says, on the record, Crimea was and still is part of Ukraine. So much for the idea that he's excusing Russian aggression. This is what drives me nuts about these hearings. The left tries to trap nominees in gotcha questions, but Lomire stands his ground. He respects Ukraine's sovereignty, period. Now, some people will say, why doesn't he just say no? Russia wasn't justified. I get it. But here's the thing. Real-world geopolitics isn't black and white. I want leaders who think before they speak, who understand that every military conflict is complicated. That's how you avoid another endless war. Lomire is right. Heads of state make decisions for their own security. That doesn't mean we agree with them, but understanding them is how we defeat them. And this is key, patriots. The Undersecretary of the Air Force isn't a diplomat. He's not setting foreign policy. His job is to make sure our airmen have the best training, the best equipment, and the support they need to defend America and our allies. If you want a rubber stamp for the administration's talking points, pick someone else. If you want someone who thinks critically and knows military history, Lomire's your man. Amen to that. We all want peace. But let's be clear, peace through strength is the only way to secure it. That means making sure Russia knows we won't back down, but also not stumbling blindly into another conflict because we refuse to learn from the past. So here's my take. Lomire handled himself with integrity and intelligence. He didn't fall for the political traps. He understands that context and strategy matter. And he's clear, Russia's invasion isn't justified. Ukraine deserves our support, and it's time for the conflict to end. But listen up. We need more leaders who aren't afraid to speak honestly, who won't be bullied by the cancel culture mob just for sharing information. If we're going to protect America, we need the best minds in our military, not just the most politically correct. That's how we stay free. What do you think, patriots? Should we demand simple yes/no answers? Or do you want leaders who understand the world's complexity? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And as always, God bless America.